Okay, Chapter 9 is on constitutions. These are the foundational written rules of law for most democratic-leaning systems. We've already talked about the U.S. Constitution. You've been assigned to read that in preparation for this chapter. So let's just quickly run back through the U.S. Constitution. The first three articles are the ones that outline the powers for the three major branches of government: legislative powers, which is responsibility of Congress; executive powers, which is the president's branch; and judicial powers, which are headed by the Supreme Court. Article 4 is the unity article, which puts all the states together in recognizing other states' records and documents, as well as their privileges and their immunities. Article 5 is outlining fairly concise amendments process to the Constitution. Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause, which states the supremacy of the federal government. And then Article 7 was the process of the Constitution being ratified. Now, one thing about constitutions in general, what they do is that first of all, they can't do it all. We do realize that some constitutions are much more detailed than other constitutions. The U.S. Constitution was the first of its kind and is relatively short compared to other constitutions. The Constitution in general sets out the processes and the structure of government, so therefore that leaves quite a bit much left in between the lines to informal arrangements between these structures or between these processes. We also know that the Supreme Court, even though this is not in the U.S. Constitution, the Supreme Court has eventually over time garnered the power to be able to overturn acts of Congress or presidential acts. This is called judicial review, to where the Supreme Court, if that case is brought before them, they can review a congressional law, and if they determine that some or part of that law violates the Constitution, they can overturn it or strike that law down. So that provides some other complications to constitutions. Typically, in the U.S. system and other systems where there is a presidential system, we'll talk about those in a later chapter as far as presidential systems versus parliamentary systems. But the president typically takes the leading role in this system, and you could argue that the president has gathered a little bit more power than what he was originally granted by the Constitution, but just because of the system that we have that requires a president to initiate things and spearhead things and at least control the agenda for which he was elected, well, he's going to be taking the leading role. And then, of course, Congress has its own bylaws of how it gets its bill making and policy making and things done. For example, the ability to filibuster in the Senate, that's not in the Constitution. That's part of one of its bylaws that has evolved over time that allows the minority party of the Senate to be able to hold up a bill that requires, and then it would require a supermajority vote for that bill to pass once the minority party has initiated the filibuster. Constitutions provide the basic foundational written rule of law. Obviously can't do it all. I've already talked about how there's quite a few variations in formalities of constitutions. As I said, older constitutions have less words. The U.S. Constitution is considerably short, relatively speaking, with 4,300 words originally, and then 2,900 words added in the amendments. And as we get into the newer, more recent constitutions, the world is more complicated now than it was. And even in 1949, Germany's had quite a few more words. And when you look at constitutions with even more recent structures, such as the EU, they are considerably larger. There is some virtue of this vagueness to a constitution, because obviously you cannot cover it all in the Constitution. nor would you even want to try, because it would just be too unwieldy and perhaps even too restrictive. Because if a constitution is too specific, it will be difficult to adapt to unforeseen circumstances. Just like any document, that you can't possibly include everything that you need to include. There will need to be some interpretation or agreement as to what that specific situation is as applied to the Constitution. The lame duck amendment is an interesting example that after Franklin Roosevelt was elected president 4 times, the Congress put through a constitutional amendment that said that the president cannot be elected for more than 2 consecutive terms. So therefore, they kind of locked that in, and it wasn't, but just not even a decade or so later, Dwight Eisenhower was a very popular Republican president that could have potentially run for a 3rd term, and the Republicans probably would have liked to have done that, but yet they were locked in with this lame duck amendment, which says a president can't run for a 3rd consecutive term. So therefore, that's an example of how you could, by being specific, perhaps even shoot yourself in the foot later on. Another example is when at the end of World War II, after the fiasco of Hitler, Germany tried to Hitler-proof its document to try to prevent something like that happening again, to where a leader could come in and pretty much subvert the parliament into a dictatorship. However, the additional complications that they put in their document made it more difficult with succession later on, and proved some embarrassment to the succession of leadership later on in the 1970s. So again, they kind of hem themselves in with a little bit too much detail. So no right or wrong answer to this, but we do see some virtue of vagueness. Of course, that does allow for potentially more arguments over the actual words. We'll talk about that a little bit more. As far as the principles of constitutional design, we'll have 3 basic things here that we'll talk about. One is long-standing traditions. This is where your Constitution is going to reflect your people's desires. Again, the United States may have had some advantages or some head starts as far as being the descendants of Western European expansionists, who were very successful and very powerful and very prosperous, comparatively speaking, which allowed for more thought, more philosophy, more innovation. So therefore, the colonists said, well, even though we are descendants of you, we've also been here long enough to figure out some of our own desires. So that's what a constitution is typically doing. So therefore, it's also kind of a product of the culture that it comes out of. But then, of course, once the rule of law gets set, then it has a very profound effect on influencing subsequent generations. It would certainly have the implied positive support for the state. You know that people aren't too crazy about governments in general or having to pay taxes, but we do know without a whole lot of argument that a world without centralized governments would be considerably more chaotic and dangerous, and life, as Hobbes said, would be nasty, brutish, and short if we did not have the ability to come together in these centralized political organizations. So therefore, the Constitution is providing some of that positive support for the state. The fact that too much transformation from not having a constitution to having a constitution is also pretty difficult. United States was fairly unique in its ability to accept a fairly complex document like our Constitution at that time. In today's world, again, you can't expect too much transformation overnight in a society, which makes the design of constitutions even more difficult, more problematic. Constitutional design should have some element of amendability. You definitely want to create a situation to where you can't change it overnight or on a whim or through some social movement of pure democracy or even mob mentality or something like that. You certainly want to make that difficult, and there's no question that the framers of our Constitution back in 1787 did want to make it very difficult to amend the Constitution. They did not want it to be able to change very quickly or easily. So there's this tendency to protect the Constitution by making it difficult to change. For example, since the Bill of Rights, which were passed in 1791 fairly quickly after our Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, of course, were submitted as somewhat of a provision for the states to pass it, the Constitution. But Constitution is only changed, has only been amended 17 times since 1791, and there have been over 8,000 attempts to amend the Constitution. So that shows you how difficult that is. Now, as I said before, the Supreme Court has assumed a role to interpret the Constitution, which is controversial, but you could certainly argue there might not be any other effective way to interpret the Constitution except through the court system, and that does provide some flexibility as far as that interpretation goes. Incentive compatibility is a fairly wordy term here that simply means that with our constitutional design, we're trying to give the office holders of our government, we're trying to give them incentives to do what society needs, balanced with some personal rewards or punishments as far as what they can or cannot do, and the fact that they are rewarded with fairly prestigious positions and decision making as to the future of our society. You can't get too much more important than that is determining the direction that our society will go. So that should be a reward in itself. But again, when self-interest is involved, you could have politicians pursuing personal gain, and so you would want to discourage that with your constitutional design. And then on the other side of that, if you give choice to people they will choose for themselves, you balance it here. You've got to keep in mind that, yes, taxes are unpopular, but we do know in order to have these centralized political systems, which are extremely useful for humankind, taxes are inevitable, just like death is, the old saying there. But if we leave people to choose for themselves, they will obviously choose to give less tax, but of course that would be less good for the overall system of our society and public goods and needs of the people. Congress, this is an interesting dilemma that congressmen find themselves in. Back to that concept of utilitarianism that we talked about, where you're trying to pursue the best or greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. So even though congressmen are elected by districts in their state, which have an average of about 710,000 people per district, they represent them and they are elected by them. However, the whole point of federal government or national government is to pass policy that is going to benefit everyone in the United States. So that's where the congressman has to balance that role of pursuing the needs of only his district members as opposed to the needs of the United States citizens as a whole. All right, so now let's talk about the concept of federalism and the difference between federal systems and unitary systems. Now, federalism simply means that you've got a national government operating separately from state governments. That's particularly in our system. We have a federal system. Federalism is one of the things that the framers of the Constitution decided to keep in place. Otherwise, the states, the original 13 states, probably would have not approved the Constitution. They probably would have not have gone for it. So therefore, this federal system provides these two layers of government, however, keeping the federal government supreme authority when it comes to final decisions. So in the federal systems, constitutions set up local authorities. These can be called states or provinces. They are typically used in large countries, large diverse countries with large populations and large expanses of territory. This is where these federal systems seem to be logically more used. So this is the big question. How much power is given or distributed to the states or to the provinces? That was a pretty big debate during the Constitution, is that how much are we actually going to specifically give to the states? And this is where the 10th Amendment is so important, because the 10th Amendment of our Constitution is the Reserved Powers Clause, which literally states that if whatever is not specifically written in the Constitution is then therefore reserved or delegated to the states. So what we have here is a lot of conflict in these federal systems is not necessarily between states and central government. The states are given considerable power and considerable autonomy to run their state systems, but a lot more conflict between local groups who aren't satisfied with central government or federal government. Now we have 21 states in the world, which is 11% of the total, that are federal systems. However, they contain about 39% of the world's population and 50% of the land area. So therefore, federal systems are popular amongst large countries, both population and land. Here is a figure showing the countries of the world that have federal systems: Canada, US, and Mexico, for example, much of South America, Australia, and Russia, some states in Europe, of course, India also, and not very many in Africa. So that gives you a breakdown of federal systems. Russia, as we've just talked about, is a federal system. Their states are not called states. They're called oblasts or okrugs, or in some cases called a republic. Quite a few republics or oblasts here in the Russian system. And for example, we hear a lot of news about Chechnya, which is a fairly small state down here in the tip of Russia, zooming in down here near the countries of Georgia and Azerbaijan. There is the Federal Republic of Chechnya, just for an example. Now let's talk about unitary systems. This is where the central government controls the entire territory. There's no breakdown other than perhaps cities and municipalities. So political power is typically more centralized, as you would expect, in unitary systems, because the entire country is controlled by the central government. So this degree of centralization, of course, is a factor of your constitutional design. So that's where the people have to come together when they decide their constitution, which is literally, the Constitution could also be called as the rules for making rules, so to speak. Now, there are a few exceptions as far as, particularly when you look at how much tax revenue is collected by the centralized government. Sweden has got a unitary system, but it draws only about 64% of government revenue. So therefore, Sweden, even though it's a unitary system, it provides for a lot of the localities or the municipalities to collect much of the local taxation. Now, United States is an interesting hybrid. You can see on in the book there is a chart that talks about the percentage of revenue collected by different levels of government. The United States, for example, the federal government, perhaps because of this federal system, collects about 60% of all tax revenue and then transfers about 9% of that back down to the state and local governments. So as you can see, which is somewhat in line with the table 9.1, which is from 2010. This is from 2013, so you'll see a little bit different numbers here. But federal on its own collects 50% of the revenue and then transfers 8% of it back to states and about 0.5% of it back to the local jurisdictions. The states themselves collect about 8% of the total tax revenue, and the state shifts about 9% of that back down to the local municipalities, and then the local municipalities, cities and counties, for example, collect about 14% of the total tax revenue in the United States. So that gives you an idea of how it's broken down in the United States federal system as far as revenues, and then transferring those back down to your federal subjects. As far as some contrast between federal versus unitary systems, too much decentralization, which would occur in a federal system, might lead to uncoordinated policies and confusion. Now, that does potentially happen at times in the United States when states are perhaps doing their own thing, and that's where the federal government has to come in and say, is this a larger issue that we need to provide some sort of mandate for everyone to be on board? And is there too much confusion between states as far as how states are enforcing their policies? Could that literally start to divide states and create migrations from one state to the next? You know, we do see that with the red state versus blue state dilemma in the United States, we could see states literally locking in as far as their policies that are leaning towards conservative ideology, and then states that are locking in policies that are leaning towards liberal ideologies. On the contrary, too much centralization, as we've said before, could lead to inflexible and insensitive government, which could be potentially obtrusive or unpopular to citizens of the country. We are seeing some converging amongst the modern industrialized states of the world. They seem to be converging on similar degrees of centralization. So this could be a converging norm to where, yes, we have to have some degree of centralization, but we do want to delegate. We do want to spread it out, as you saw with Sweden. Sweden is a unitary system, but it does spread out the responsibility somewhat, almost as much as the United States does, as far as local jurisdictions being able to tax and control their local jurisdictions. Now, as far as some common elements of constitutions, most have some form of Bill of Rights, which we've talked about. We'll look at that again here in a minute. And we've also talked about how under the chapter of justice, we typically want the rule of law not to be applied arbitrarily, but somewhat equally. A lot of difficulty in doing that. And the concept of constitutionalism, particularly in the United States, has brought up some interesting debate. Do we faithfully adhere to the letter and spirit of the original word of the Constitution? This is called the originalists. And then the evolutionists are saying, well, the Constitution is somewhat like a living document that grows and evolves and adapts to the current society. So there's a little bit of both going on there. Clearly, the framers of 1787 were in a much different world than we have today, but the original intents are still studied. So that brings up an interesting debate amongst jurisprudence scholars. Clearly, we have amended the Constitution, but we do see that it's getting more and more difficult to amend the Constitution. The book talks about case study on Great Britain. Interestingly enough, even though we are kind of a product of Great Britain does not have a written constitution. It is one of the oldest representative type systems in the world, with the parliament going all the way back to the Magna Carta, which was kind of the forerunner to a parliament system, and then back on up to the Glorious Revolution in 1688, where the parliament essentially took control over policy making from the monarchy. So therefore, we are a product of that. So it took a long time to evolve and never had a written constitution. So therefore, it's based on statutes, court precedents, and practice of what happens in the system. Individual rights have evolved over centuries of court decisions, property rights going all the way back to the beginning of societies as we came together in communities over agricultural areas, and we developed juries, courts of law, things like that. So the individual rights for Great Britain evolved over a long period of time. What's interesting, though, is that this system is unlikely to be imitated. We live in a world that's complex now that in particular, we don't even have the time to evolve rights over centuries. People want and need these rights fairly quickly, and they would need to be established in the written document. Now, entry into the EU, which is still being debated, provided a significant change to Great Britain's system because now they have another layer that they feel obligated to. We also have seen Great Britain voted to exit from the EU, quite a controversial development. It is a fairly common debate. I mean, you can go all the way back to the United States when they were fighting for their independence, and then once we had our Articles of Confederation, we had lots of problems, and then the fact that we needed a stronger central government, that was still hotly debated because the states said, what? Another layer of government? Not too crazy about that. But we evolved into a federal system that was incredibly successful, comparatively speaking. Now, the U.S. Constitution has been declining in influence over the years. By the late 1980s, 160 out of 170 countries had modeled their constitutions after ours, either directly or indirectly. But however, it's reversed course since then. And one of the major reasons is that the United States Constitution, as you may have noticed in your class exercise, guarantees relatively few rights. Now, in the Article 1, Section 9, it talks about the right of habeas corpus, the right to no bill of attainder, the right to no ex post facto laws. Those are some basic rights that the Constitution guarantees, and it also guarantees a Republican form of government. So the Constitution did not guarantee a whole lot of rights. That's one of the reasons why they added the Bill of Rights to articulate those ones that we've just talked about. Countries that are coming into the stage of development today where they may need a constitution or a new constitution, well, they are in a situation where they need quite a few more rights articulated, guaranteed, that we take for granted. So another thing that may be off-putting to new nations is this concept of originalism, to where even our own country we're debating over the fact that the Constitution as written should predominate, whereas a lot of these countries in the world are trying to adapt to the world as it is today, and they're saying that, well, your originalist idea of a constitution is not applying to us as much anymore. So we have also a waning influence of U.S. power that has been probably long happening, and even perhaps even since the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, where the United States, even though we are probably the biggest and most prosperous power, certainly the strongest military power in the world, we don't necessarily feel the need to use that. And that could be having to do with the waning influence of U.S. power or our prestige in the world. Our economy has taken some pretty major hits, so we're not the ideal model that we perhaps were before. And we do know that our Supreme Court has been very politically driven. We now have a system where even our courts are ideologically divided, and that is off-putting as well to new countries who are trying to create their own systems. The U.S. Constitution is also extremely difficult to amend. Arguably, you could say the most difficult to amend. That is not attractive to some countries. The U.S. Constitution may be out of step with the needs of other countries, particularly developing countries. So that's some of the reasons why our U.S. Constitution is declining a little bit. Now, are there other rights worth us addressing? Clearly, there's some things that we take for granted in the United States that may not be needed in an additional Bill of Rights. In some countries, you really don't have much right to move around or to travel. Might not apply much to us. Would there be a need to put it in your Constitution or to express the right that you are presumed innocent until proven guilty? That's commonly accepted in the United States, but not specifically guaranteed. Could there actually be a guarantee of education or even health care in the United States? If we consider health care a public good, could that be a guarantee? Could there potentially be a guarantee of equality, which has other problematic elements as far as guaranteeing that, but could that be a possibility? Could there be a right to private property, even though the United States is very much a system that is conducive to property rights, but could that be put in there? Could there be some worker rights put into an additional Bill of Rights as far as the right to strike or the right to have a minimum wage or the right to have favorable working conditions, that sort of thing? And in a world where corporations are gaining more and more power, could there be some consumer rights to have decent products for decent prices? Could that actually be put in a Bill of Rights? Could there be a right to information? Now that we've got the internet, could there be even a right to access to the internet, to have the internet, to have information that, regardless of where it's produced in government, could there be a right to information? That could be an interesting one. Should there be some rights for children? Because in this world where it gets more complicated, we have more and more families that are not staying together or different types of families. Could there be certain rights guaranteed to children?
Okay.
What are the principles of constitutional design? What are the major differences between federal and unitary systems? What are the major rights in those first to 10 amendments? Probably not a bad idea to memorize the basic first 10 amendments there.